First of all, thank you to everyone that has joined us this evening. Thank you to everyone that's been here through all of our panel discussions or all of our presentations over the last month. It's been really fun. I've learned a lot. I'm excited to be able to talk about the building that I work in every day today, and also learn more from you guys because you are in the nitty gritty and literally in the walls. So thank you all again, all the attendees for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for being here tonight. For everybody joining us, that's okay. For everyone that's joining us this evening, please consider becoming a member of the Crested Butte Museum or for making a donation so that we can continue to offer programming like this. In terms of programming, we're very excited. We are having the Black and White Ball on Sunday, June 28th. We're calling it the Black and Not Right Now Ball, and it's a virtual event. So be sure to go to crestedbuttemuseum.com to check it out and see all the cool stuff that we're going to be doing for that event on June 28th. And be sure to register for that. Many of you already know this, but for anybody new to tonight's talk, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. We will have times for questions at the last 15 minutes, and we'll try to answer everybody's questions. There is also going to be a survey at the end, so when you close down everything, a survey will pop up. If you have not filled out the survey, please do so. The reason that we do it is so we know what it is that you want, what our attendees and what our members and what our guests and our visitors, we want to know what you guys want. So please do take the time to tell us in that survey. Thank you to our panelists, Executive Director Shelley Popke, Architect Jessica Reske, and owner of Mo Better Builders, Kevin Donovan. Unfortunately, our Dwayne Vandenbush will not be joining us tonight. He had an unexpected schedule conflict that he did not foresee, and he sends his apologies not only to the panelists, but also to our attendees. However, our panelists are intimately acquainted with the history of the building, and they will fill us in. So one more time, if you want to see more programming like this or to support the museum, please visit crestedbuttemuseum.com to become a member or to make a donation. And Shelley, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, Nell, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start by thanking Nell for coming with the idea for this virtual speaker series and for creating it and moderating it. I'd also like to thank all of the presenters that have joined us. I have learned so much during the series, and it's really enriched my knowledge of preservation in the Gunnison Valley. We are sad that Dwayne can't join us today, but the museum, Jessica, and Kevin, all three of us received the 2020 Stephen Hart Award for Historic Preservation from History Colorado, which is a prestigious award that our state's history organization hands out every year. And in alignment with that, they made a video about our project that features Dwayne and me. So we're gonna take a look at that now, and then I'll come back and talk more about the history of the building and the project.
Sorry, everybody. It seems that we didn't have audio. Apologies. Let me try that again.
We love that people can walk through the front doors and walk back in time and experience the building the way that it has been over the years. This building is affectionately known as Tony's Conoco. The first part was built in 1883. It was a blacksmith shop. And then over the years, it evolved to adding on this hardware store in the front by 1904. The Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum was formed in 1993. In 2001, the museum purchased this building. We wanted to keep this front area looking like it did when it shut down in 1996, when Tony Mihalich, who was the owner of this business, passed away.
Tony Mihalich was the longest serving Conoco owner in the United States. President Carter, every year he came up, he would come in, two Secret Service men would come in, anybody else in the museum, they would be asked politely to leave for about an hour. And ex-President Carter would sit in front of the pot-bellied stove and he would have 1 hour with Tony Mihalich.
People can walk around and enjoy both the feel of the building and the history of the building, and then look at our exhibits and learn about the history of Crested Butte.
You can see everything. You can see the age of coal, you can see the age of silver, you can see the age of skiing. The building has made everybody in Crested Butte and the Gunnison country proud.
We were very fortunate to receive 3 rounds of grant funding from the History Colorado State Historical Fund. The town of Crested Butte gave us grant funding, and then wonderful donors in the community stepped up and donated to our Preserve Tony's campaign. And so we were able to fully fund our project and then also create a $100,000 building preservation fund, because we really wanted to make sure that we had cash in the bank to take care of our future building maintenance.
Crested Butte is located at almost 9,000 feet. We get about 300 inches of snow a year. The temperature can drop to 20 degrees below zero. So anytime you've got an old building like Tony's Conoco, now the museum, you've got all kinds of difficulties with snow on the roof.
We had a wonderful team working with our contacts at the State Historical Fund, and then also our architect and engineers and general contractors, and everybody who worked on this building was delighted and proud to be able to contribute to taking care of it for the future. We host a lot of events here at the museum, both to share our history and to gather new history, but to also bring the community together. We're taking care of a building, but we're really taking care of the heart of our community.
Thanks for enjoying that video with me. And again, Jessica and Kevin and REG, locally our engineering group, for being part of the team that made this whole project happen. And now I'm going to jump into our presentation. About the rehabilitation of the Crested Butte hardware, also affectionately known as Tony's Conoco. So this is a picture of our building before the project started. You can see significant deterioration on the roof and a lot of challenges that aren't quite so apparent, but we will be telling you about. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the history of the building itself and how this project happened. We don't have a lot of photos from the early days of the Crested Butte hardware, but we do have a wonderful resource in the Sanborn fire insurance maps that can be found on the Library of Congress website, and we've put the link into the chat. So if any of you map geeks like me haven't had a chance yet to dig around yet, these maps are a fascinating, very detailed depiction of Crested Butte during its early years around the turn of the century. And and they're a really wonderful resource for us to see how our building started off and how it evolved. So this is a photo, or this is what our building looked like from the 1883 Sanborn map. And you can see, as we talked about before, that it started off as a blacksmith shop in the rear portion of the lot. And then this is a section from the 1890 Sanborn map, and you can see that they added on an iron warehouse. By 1893, some more structures were added to connect the buildings together. And the buildings are all wood frames, so they really were able to add on, and this was a very common thing that happened in Crested Butte. As if you take a closer look at these Sanborn maps, you'll see that buildings were added onto, they were moved. It was a very dynamic place. A cobbler shop was added. And then by 1904, the front section, the hardware store portion of the building was added. And that's when it became the Crested Butte Hardware. Now, Joe McCosker was the owner, and he started the blacksmith shop and continued to run it. He also owned it when he installed the town's first retail gas pumps that were installed out front. And he sold the thriving auto supply and hardware business to John Campbell and former Gunnison County Commissioner Bill Whalen in 1922. The Sanborn maps, actually the latest version of them, the latest Sanborn map is 1910, and you can see that the warehouse area, that was a coal storage area later on, had been added on by that time. That's where currently the museum store is. And so by 1922, McCosker sold it to Campbell and Whalen. And Tony Mihalich, who was Whalen's son-in-law, started working in the hardware store in 1939. So this photo was right before Tony started working in the store. And Tony became owner of the thriving business in 1952 and operated it until 1996. And he passed away at the age of 93 on Christmas Day in 1996. So this is the oldest photo that we have of our building. There are a fair amount of photos of Crested Butte, but they tend to not be of this part of town. There was a lot more activity further up on Elk Avenue, and so those are a lot of the photos that we have. We are always looking for more photos, so if any of you have photos of this side of town from earlier on or anytime, please contact us. We would love to add them to our collections. Here's some photos as the building evolved. This one is from 1975 to 1979. You can see people stopping to get gas. This one's in 82. You can see how that was a good snow year. And one thing that we still struggle with today is clearing the snow off the west side of the roof because of the pitch there. And you can tell somebody's been up there shoveling, like you'll see us doing every winter here. Here's another photo from 1984. And you can see how the building is deteriorating. Our harsh climate really takes its toll on these wood frame buildings. Here's a photo of the interior with Tony with the potbelly stove, which is such a wonderful element that we still have today. And the world record elk shot by John Plute is on the wall there. He did leave our building for quite a number of years, but we got him back a few years ago and are just thrilled that he's back in the exact same location. So Tony was a beloved person in Crested Butte. He was a Croatian immigrant, and he ran the hardware store and gas station and was a very hardworking, very kind person, and people love to stop by. We have actually Megan Eflin, the granddaughter of Dick Eflin, who started the ski resort along with Rice in 1960. she wrote a wonderful article about her memories of stopping by and seeing Tony, and he would always give the kids a piece of candy. The hardware was also a social gathering spot. Here is the grand tradition of bench surfing, which still continues to this day. We love that people frequent the benches that we have in front of the museum. And people would also gather around the potbelly stove to tell stories, talk about the old days, sort of an informal social club, talk about what's going on around town. And this was a place that some people that moved here, the mid-timers that moved here in the 70s, really talked about coming to Tony's Conoco and meeting the old timers and talking around the stove and learning stories. So this was really an important gathering spot and place where stories were preserved and were passed on in our community. And oral history is such an important part of the community's history. So we feel really lucky that the museum was able to purchase this building and rehabilitate it so that we could call it our home. So like we talked about in the video, I started working as the executive director at the museum January 1st, 2015. We realized that the museum definitely needed a paint job at that time. But as we looked into it a little bit more, we realized that the roof was compromised and that there were other issues with the building. And so we purchased it and did our first rehabilitation phase between 2001 and 2003. And the community really rose up and helped us raise the money to purchase the building and to do that first phase of rehabilitation. But time definitely took its toll on different parts of the building. And so we really wanted to address those and be proactive in terms of stewarding this cultural asset. And so we applied for a historic structure assessment grant in 2015, and we're able to do a comprehensive analysis of what the building needed and a phased approach to rehabilitating it. We did phase one, we received grant funding, and then our cash match we raised from the town of Crested Butte and amazing donors and community members that helped us fundraise that cash match. And we did phase one the year of 2016 and 17. And then we received another round of grant funding from the State Historical Fund, as well as cash match funds from the community in 2018 and 2019. And we were able to complete this project in the spring of 2019. And then this year we were awarded the 2020 Hart Award. So it was a very fast process, relatively fast process from starting to envision what we wanted to do to completing it and to really being able to show off our work both within our community but also within the state. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jessica and Kevin that will tell you more about different aspects of the rehabilitation.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. So the first step in the process, like Shelley mentioned, was a historic structure assessment. And the historic structure assessment, if you're not familiar with that process, takes a holistic look at the building from top to bottom, inside, outside. I've heard people describe it as almost a physical for the building. And then you get kind of a laundry list of all the deficiencies. And part of the historic structure assessment process is then developing a phasing plan to address all of these deficiencies. The downside to the historic structure assessment is it's really a non-destructive investigation. So we're not taking the building apart. We're not really digging into hidden conditions, which can lead to both good and bad unforeseen conditions when you get into construction. For example, you can see in the middle photo on the slide on the bottom, there's a shim under the one end of the display case. And when we saw that in the historic structure assessment process, we thought that the foundation on the east side of the building was compromised and was going to need work. So fortunately, the strategy that we chose was to monitor that side of the building to see if there was still movement occurring and what needed to happen there. Because we actually found a good unforeseen condition in that we didn't need to do anything because that area was stable. But Kevin and I will talk a little bit about the unforeseen conditions on the west side of the building, which weren't so good. Shelley, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So one of the main components of the project was the front facade rehabilitation. So it's really the main face of the building, the part that everyone sees, something that draws people to it, one of the historic character defining features of the building for sure. So on the front side, you can see that most of the notes in the drawings, most of the conditions really addressed kind of cosmetic issues, you know, siding that needed to be repaired and painted, roofing that needed to be replaced, some new flashing, things like that. But if you go to the next slide, you can see at the corner of the building, things were pulling apart a little bit more. So these were the conditions that we observed when we were doing the historic structure assessment. And at that time, we were really not quite sure how far the deterioration went or if it really was primarily cosmetic. So thankfully, as Kevin got into it, we were able to open things up and see it a little bit more. Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk this slide or the next slide about what you found.
Well, what we found, which probably people could almost see from the street, was that the false front was beginning to heading toward ending up in the street, and that's because, well, the structure itself was just basically a tall frame 2x4 wall is the false front, and with not a whole lot to keep it level or plumb over the years with wind blowing, and then add to that the overhang over the gas pumps. When that loads up with snow, I saw particularly that picture from 1982 or whatever it was, where nobody had been shoveling it, and that puts in a tremendous amount of stress on that whole wall trying to pull it away. Which it had separated 2.5, 3 inches at the top from the roof, and it had been sort of flashed over, but the whole thing was basically heading toward the Kevin.
So next slide, you can kind of see an overall view of the roof and the back side of that wall. The before picture is on the left and the after photos on the right. And then you can see kind of how we documented the parapet at this point in time, just with some general notes in terms of what to repair on the backside as well. Luckily, we were also doing a roof replacement project as part of this phase of work. And as Kevin was taking the roof apart, discovered some anchor points that came in handy. Kevin, I don't know if you want to take it from here.
Well, there were, and I didn't see any in the old photographs, but there were definite signs on the parapet wall that it at one time had some kind of stabilization, or had been tied back into the roofs with whatever, probably wire. It wasn't there anymore. So that's when Jessica said, well, then there's a historic precedent for that. We could do a similar thing. Although I'd have to say we probably did it more robustly than it had been done the first time.
Which is probably okay.
Probably okay, yes. Probably really. So now I feel pretty confident that that's going to stay. And that's a pretty neat picture. You can see the bracket on the peak, but you can just almost not see the cable that's there, a quarter inch, I think it's a quarter inch cable. And that's looking pretty plumb. We got it pretty close to plumb when it was started about 3 inches out. So let's feel good about that one. And hopefully it'll stay that way.
Yes. So the roof replacement, like Shelley mentioned, was one of the evident deficiencies in the historic structure assessment. And not only was the poor condition of the roof posing a risk to the building finishes inside and outside, but also to all the museum contents if water were to really start getting into the building. So one of the challenges in replacing a historic roof like this, as much as it might seem to just be a simple corrugated metal roof, there's actually a lot of options in choosing roofing materials. So Shelley, Kevin, and I took an afternoon and kind of wandered around town and looked at different precedents and different sheens and profiles, and really tried to hone in on what materials would look best on this particular building. We knew that we didn't want anything super shiny. It's right on the corner, so it would be almost blinding to both pedestrians and drivers going by. But in addition to that, it really doesn't look right to put a bright, shiny roof on a building that has such great character and patina to it. Currently, it's just kind of a jarring adjustment. So luckily, Kevin had a great product in mind, and we were able to get the metal roof that you see on there today. You can see a couple pictures of the roof going on. You can also see in the in-progress photo that we added some ice and water shield to also aid with the long-term weather tightness of the roofing system. If you go to the next slide, you can see that in addition to replacing the roof, we added some flashing to the building. You can see at the roof edge along the west side in particular, there was no flashing. And in that particular case, it was a consistent problem with paint failure and wood deterioration, just from the snow coming off the roof, from water shedding. And then once the roof had started to deteriorate, it was kind of coming through holes in the roof as well. So lots of things were contributing to that condition. One of the things that we really consider when we're replacing the roof on a historic building and adding flashing is making sure that it doesn't detract from the historic appearance or the historic character of the building. So making sure that it's tucked underneath materials, as hidden as possible, using colors that kind of blend in, while also maintaining best practices in terms of installing flashing and waterproofing where it's actually needed. Kevin, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to mention about the roof going on.
Well, I kind of wanted to just mention that when we took off the old roof, there was a panel that on the underside of it, in kind of like a black crayon, I want to say. It was something durable, but it had the date of delivery of the original, or I think it was delivery rather than manufacturer. I'm not exactly sure which, but it was, and Shelley and I were talking about this earlier this morning. I thought it said 1905. Shelley she has the piece out in the shed, but she couldn't get the shed open, and she thought it was 1911. But my point sort of being that was a durable product, and over 100 years that metal was on the roof, and so I don't feel bad about replacing it, especially because all of that roofing metal is now being used over in Pampa as siding on a shop there. So that's metal roofing is a long-lasting product, or can be.
So looking at the west wall of the building, I had mentioned that the east wall was in better shape, but the west wall was actually in much worse condition than we had expected. So we started taking a little bit of it apart as part of the first phase of the rehabilitation project to really get a good idea of what we were going to encounter and how bad the conditions were, which also allowed then a more accurate cost estimate and more accurate drawings and details to go into the phase 2 documents. So as much as it can be maybe frustrating to prolong the project by splitting it into phases, I think it can also have some benefits at times because it does allow for some exploration in earlier phases to kind of better set you up for longer term phases in the future. You can see that when it was opened up, there was deteriorated framing. We had initially planned to replace the lower siding boards. They had been previously replaced. So that was already kind of in the works. We also then decided to add some flashing, which you can see in the picture in the middle on the bottom there. And really all of these conditions were due to drainage issues, and then, as you've seen in numerous pictures now, the snow that piles up against those walls. So we did take advantage of having that opened up to put a concrete footer along that side of the building. You can see it in that detail of the foundation replacement to really try to get the water away from the wood and to get the wood out of the ground. We did run the siding down as low as we really could reasonably do so to try to conceal as much of that concrete and metal as possible to make it look as authentic and original as possible as well. And then you can see we also took the opportunity to install some insulation both at the foundation and then up higher in the wall as well. And Kevin, I don't remember how many boards we ended up replacing, but I think we moved the original ones up on the wall to try to protect them a little bit more.
We ended up, I want to say, probably close to a third of the boards on that back wall. Yeah, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll have to be replaced again. you know, it's just regardless of the drain. At least now the rainwater is I think much better dealt with than it was before. There's still really not a whole heck of a lot that can be done about that huge amount of snow piling up. Rather, other than just put temporary plywood up every winter.
And one thing we were able to do since we dug up the whole garden area to put in the concrete and to redo that wall is we applied for a grant and received a grant through the Colorado Garden Foundation to redo the garden area, and we graded it so that the water now flows away from the building and into the street rather than pooling up against the building. And we also redid the landscaping so that now we just have brick against the building and nothing that we are passively irrigating that could end up causing water infiltration.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it looks nice.
It looks great.
Yeah.
It looks great.
So one of the other aspects of the historic structure assessment component of the project was identifying accessibility and code issues for the building. So the museum really has a goal of being welcoming to everyone, and part of that is making the whole building accessible from the entrance all the way throughout the building as much as possible. Sometimes, as we all know, that can be a real challenge in historic buildings, given the finishes and steps in floor surfaces, and especially when you have a building like this where it was constructed over a number of years with various additions and dates of construction and different materials. So in the back part of the building, the floor is concrete, and it had a lot of cracks and spalls and areas where it was slightly heaved, and it was really kind of an uneven walking surface, and also then posed some challenges for displays and moving things around within that area. So in order to address that, we didn't want to lose the character of that floor, so we refinished the flooring. We used an oil stop primer, and then we put an epoxy surfacing on it. So you can see the end result in the overall photo as well as the photo on the left at the bottom there. And we think it has retained a good amount of the character, and you can still certainly tell what the historic material was, but it also has given the museum a bit of a better floor surface to work with. The other piece of accessibility that was really critical was the front entry condition. You can see that in the next slide. And before we started either phase of the project, there was that step up at the concrete sidewalk, and then there was also a pretty high threshold going into the building. The challenge being if you take the threshold out entirely, now you have a large gap at the bottom of the doors, which is clearly not ideal for a number of reasons. So the concrete was, I'll say, fairly easy. Kevin might disagree with me, but fairly easy to address in that we could just remove the raised section of concrete and then gently slope it back out to the sidewalk. So there was no need for any sort of ramp or anything beyond that. The threshold was a little bit trickier. Getting the threshold down a little bit so that it was an easier entryway for people who are mobilely impaired was a little more challenging. You can see the end result in the lower photos there. But not only were we able to get the threshold height reduced, we also did some modifications to the lower section of the door. That lower rail was modified, and then some weather stripping was installed to really bridge that gap. So I think, Kevin, you did a great job. You can't really tell that the door was altered, and I think it's a better entry condition overall for the museum.
Yeah, the door is actually, I can't remember exactly, but like 1.5 inches longer. Our ex-mayor, Glenn Michael, added something to the bottom of that door. And then we have a nice piece of Iowa grown walnut as a threshold there now, which is not traditional. Maybe I should have told you that, Jessica, but not found in Crested Butte. You couldn't get walnut in Crested Butte, but it's very durable. So
that's okay. We know it was clearly a later modification. There's no false sense of history.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Well, and I can attest that firsthand these changes that we've made, as well as installing a new HVAC system and adding insulation and putting new UV coating on our windows to protect our artifacts. All these things have made such a tangible difference to our experience of working in the museum and also to our visitor experience. people used to trip all the time on that. We called it the trip hazard, and you could see how we would spray paint it yellow so that people would see it a little bit better, and we'd warn people, but really just to be able to make it easy for people of all abilities to come into the museum and to enjoy it and to walk back in time and to enjoy our exhibits. It really, and to make our space more flexible, it has made a world of a difference.
Yeah, it's neat.
I wanted to, before we move on to Q&A, share just a couple interesting stories about things that we discovered during this process. One of the things I love about sort of exploring an old building is that you really never know what you're going to find until you get into it. And one thing that Ian Risley, who works with Kevin Donovan, found under one of the floorboards in the north section of the hardware store building, was this old shoe. And we've got a couple different profiles of it. And Nell looked into the history of shoes in buildings, and it turns out that in the 18th and 19th century, particularly on the East Coast, it was a common practice to put one shoe in the floorboards of a building to protect the building. And so we found this one shoe, and there wasn't like a lot of other trash around that might have indicated that maybe a pack rat hauled it in or something like that. It was just this shoe that was there. And I was just so delighted I had no idea that this even happened. In the chat, you can find a link to a little bit of the history of shoes being hidden and what the story is behind that. And, you know, in the end, it's all a mystery, but it's also an opportunity to learn about folklore and about practices that people have done through the ages. And considering when that hardware store section was added on, sometime between 1893 and 1904, so kind of the turn of the century, that would have been at the time when people were following this practice. And if any of you have any more experience or information, if you found shoes in rehabbing buildings around town or in other places, please let us know, because it's a really interesting story. One other thing that we found was this is the rear section of the hardware store portion of the building, and the wall covering had significantly deteriorated over the years. It was warped, it had separated from the wall, there was mold going on, and so we knew that we needed to address that issue. And so our initial plan was to replace it with a similar material. It was difficult to find something exactly the same, and we tried to come up with different ways to address it. But what we found when Kevin and his team opened up the wall was actually exterior siding, which coincides with the story we were telling before with the Sanborn maps about how the building evolved and was added on to. And so what we decided to do was clean it up and use it as another form of telling the story of the building, and show the maps and show how the building evolved over the years. And so we were excited to find this artifact, and Mike Owens, our historic preservation officer, was they oversee the project and make sure that we're following the Secretary of the Interior standards throughout the project, and he was delighted about it as well. And so it really adds another experience and another way for us to share the history of the building and of Crested Butte with people that walk through our doors. Now we'd love to open it up to questions. Feel free to.
All right, yeah, we're gonna spend the last bit of our session here today taking questions. Please remember to visit CrestedButteMuseum.com to become a member or to consider making a donation to support programming like this. Right off the bat, there's a question from Eric Roddick that is actually for me. In the video with you and Dwayne, there was a bench inside the museum. Do you know the story behind that bench? Megan and Gillian actually have one that look exactly like it. So that bench is originally a fraternal union bench. I believe it came out of the what is now the rug store. And then it spent some of its life at the UCC church. And somehow it ended up in Grand Junction in a storage shed. And we recently received it to the museum about 2 years ago, I believe. There is a little plaque on that bench that gives a little more information about the donor who owned it and how it ended up where it did. So like I said, I think it's from the rug store, but I'm not entirely sure. So it'd be worth a double check. Secondly, also from Eric, is when you replace the siding, do you need custom millwork to replicate the original siding? When you do that, do you also use period correct nail reproductions?
Should I answer that? I guess we did not use period correct nail reproductions in this project because everything was getting painted. So we did, the wood that went on was custom ordered to try to have the same dimensions as and profile as what was on there, but we just used traditional nails. Now, on the train depot where we worked, we did there were visible nails like in the floor planks of the sort of the main room, the freight room, and there we did get reproduction nails to match the old ones, which is another cool story. I'll not go into it right now.
All right. The next is not really a question, but a story about Tony and the museum, or Tony's Conoco. It's from Heidi Hornaday, and she says hello.
Oh.
She says, I didn't know Tony became owner in 1952. My granny bought our house in 1953. This helps explain how my grandparents knew Tony and his family. Additionally, in the early 60s, before we had a landline, Tony's Conoco was the emergency contact number that my dad, a hospital administrator, gave his staff. They didn't call often, but when they did, Tony sent a runner to notify my dad. Pretty cool. Thanks for sharing, Heidi. Beverly Jordy asks, what year did the museum move into Tony's?
So we purchased it in 2001 and then spent 2 years rehabbing the building and then turning the garage area into exhibit space. And we opened with a thank you to the community party, and that was our first annual Black and White Ball on July 2nd, 2003. And since then, we've continued the tradition of celebrating our community and our history and our museum every year, as we will be doing on June 28th virtually this year. But yeah, it was an enormous undertaking for the museum. We were previously located at 2nd and Sopris in the Spreitzer House, which is a fantastic building. I worked there showing people around and really enjoyed the building, but it's considering that in many ways we're a one-street town, moving to the museum dramatically increased our visitorship, our visibility, and then really being able to move into this building and turn it into a museum so we could preserve the heritage and tell the stories of the people that worked here was really important to us. So there were some amazing leaders that made that happen, including Susan Medville, who was the executive director at the time. Pinky Shuley was the board president. Marilyn Phillips was the treasurer. Molly Miniman was working for the town. I'm sure I'm forgetting things. Bob Gilly was involved. So I apologize for anyone that I've forgotten, and it would be impossible to say everyone because the community really stepped up. It was a huge effort for us, and it was a really special day to open our doors in 2003 as the museum.
All right. Next question is from Cindy Petito. What was the use of the upstairs area, which is now our offices, in back of the building during Tony's time there?
Well, it's my understanding that it was storage, and I've talked to some people that were involved in cleaning out the building. You can imagine, given its long history, that things just kind of kept being put up in that area, and I guess it was quite a undertaking, quite a treasure hunt to take out to clean that area out and turn it basically into sort of storage, decades and decades of storage into a usable space that we're now able to use as our offices. We use it for collection storage, and we have a beautiful big table that we can use for meetings and for working on donations that we have. So we've really turned it from a storage area into a very functional, usable space.
All right. Next up is a comment from Natan Bilo. He says, first, I want to commend the staff for rehabbing such a landmark of our town and want to say that the job that Kevin did on Tony's was fantastic. Well done. Tony would be very proud of what you were all doing. So big kudos to you guys. It is, I certainly appreciate not freezing in the winter and having a new roof. That's very nice.
It's a team effort, for sure. Big team effort.
Just myself living through the rehab of this, I knew that every day was kind of a bit of a surprise. We never knew what to expect. So I wanted to ask all of you, you know, other than the shoe and the wall, what was the more challenging thing to really deal with this in this building? What, you know, not necessarily what was the most interesting find, but what was the most challenging part of this project?
Jessica, what about you?
I thought you might call on me. I don't know. I think, you know, overall in a historic preservation project, a lot of the challenge comes in with using new materials and trying to retain that historic character and appearance, you know, while changing some details slightly to make it more waterproof or to make it more functional for a modern use. You know, use as a museum is very different from use as a hardware store and a blacksmith shop. So things like, I remember standing in the museum with the window film samples that Kevin had, you know, kind of holding them up to the windows because we were trying to figure out which one would have the least impact on the color of the glass and the overall appearance of the building, and kind of also balancing that with protecting the museum's collection that's inside the building. So I think things like that, where it was like in the nitty-gritty details, were kind of the day-to-day challenges. You know, it's great to have a great museum staff with opinions about how they live and work in their space and what is the right thing to do. Because in this case, I think the building is, you know, maybe the biggest item in the collection. And then, you know, Kevin's knowledge of materials and historic preservation was just so valuable in finding the right thing to do in some of these cases.
Yeah, for me, it's probably the most challenging thing is, well, deciding, are we going to keep this part? Are we going to replace this or keep it? Ideally, you just can't approach it like you would sort of a normal deteriorated house, where most things there you just say, okay, we're going to take the most practical approach to fixing this. Here, we've got to weigh the practicality with the historic aspects. Like on that west wall, you know, if we're just speaking total practicality, we probably would have made the entire back wall concrete, you know, something like that. And completely, you know, cut the wall that was there out, exposing the whole inside museum to the weather for a while, and just things that you can't do. So that's, I don't know, it's the day-to-day little decisions about what to do in each little place. That's I think the hardest thing. So
from my perspective, you know, a lot of the work that happened on the building was on the exterior. So it was just fun to come to work and to see what was going on, but it didn't really impact our day-to-day kind of going into the office, or even being able to have people come in and shop in the store and visit the museum.
Yeah.
The the element that had the biggest impact was redoing the concrete floor in the back. And that was also, we were sort of trying out different techniques. Rob Dickinson with Precise Painting was really hands-on with trying to use this epoxy method, but still have it look like concrete and have the same feel. And I must say, it is a vast improvement to have a floor surface that we can move shelves and all sorts of things around on easily. It's easy to clean. It used to be a very porous and jagged surface with breaks in the concrete. It was fascinating to see really how kind of crumbly and thin the concrete layer was. It was it was a lot less robust than I expected, and then to come up with a solution that has really served the museum well. It definitely disrupted our lives for a while. I'd say that was probably the most disruptive, but in the end, it has made such a huge difference to being able to use the space better, because we hold events and we move, you know, big cases around and everything that are on casters. We put the gondola, which used to be in place, a static artifact. We put that on a platform with casters, and now we can just, one person can move it around and move it out of the way if we're going to have a speaker series or a movie night. And so that has just made our space so much more flexible and user-friendly, and we really want to be a space for the community to gather and share stories and histories and enjoy all this stuff together. So it made a huge difference in how we can end up serving our mission.
This is a question for Jessica and Kevin. Your names have come up in several of our other webinars, and with all the rehabs that you guys have been involved in. Overall in Crested Butte, how many historic buildings have you two had your hands in?
Well, I think Kevin's had way more involvement than me, since I have a little bit of a distance to travel to get there. But I worked on the Crested Butte Railroad Depot. They had, I think, 3 phases of work over there, and then 2 phases of work at the museum, plus the historic structure assessment. And then more recently, we did the collections assessment for preservation program grant with you all last summer. But it's been great working up there. Love it.
Yeah, I've worked besides those 2 projects with Jessica on the depot. I think I just worked on phase 1 and 3, or 2 and 3, I guess. Not all of them, but then I've done a bunch of work for the State Historic Society or State Historic Fund in Gothic. 5 or 6 different projects there with different architects, and you know, not to play favorites, but Jessica's my favorite, so she's the best to work with. Just saying, we break that from the record. That wasn't very professional. That is true. So.
No, this project had a great team. I really appreciate everyone who worked on it.
We just got a comment from Karen Altrigott. You guys are amazing. Yes, you guys are. Thank you for preserving history. This place is a cornerstone. Awesome memories of getting candy and fishing licenses from Tony, late 70s and 80s. So, you know, that's what strikes me the most about this building and working in this building is everybody's very personal connection with it, which I always find just lovely. Shelley, what's up? What's next for the museum? What's the big project? What's happening? What should everybody know about?
Well, we were excited to do the collections assessment program to take a look at all of the artifacts. Yes, the building is definitely our biggest artifact, but we have, Nell, you would know better in terms of general numbers, but tens of thousands of artifacts that are a part of our collection. We take very seriously our responsibility to care for them. And so we were thrilled to both go through the museum assessment program and then the collections assessment program and get grant funding for that to see how we can best care for the individual items within our collection and then how they work within our building. One of the biggest challenges we have is storage. And so we are looking at some options for climate-controlled off-site storage so that we can continue to take items into our collection and take care of them properly, because we're very serious about being a professional museum, that if we accept items into our collection, that we can make a commitment to taking care of them. But that will mean finding more offsite storage. So we've got some ideas brimming. The pandemic has been a little tricky with moving things forward at the pace that we may have liked, but that's okay. And if any of you have any ideas, we would love to hear them.
All right. One last comment again from Eric. Thank you for this. It's been a wonderful way for me to connect to a town that my fiance grew up in with her father starting in the late 60s. And thank you, Eric, for being with us through all of these. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for putting this great presentation together. Just another plug, we've got the Black and White Ball coming up June 28th. Make sure you go to our website to check out what's going on there and register. Feel free to call us at 970-349-1880 with any questions. Recordings of all these webinars are made available also at crestview.museum.com. And please consider becoming a member, and please consider making a donation to support our largest artifact, the museum, as well as all the other good stuff that we do. So thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good job, Nell.
Thanks, Nell.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.